We are sometimes a little unhappy because of the slow and tedious way in which the Western mind seeks to explore the problems of man's inner life. We have advanced so rapidly in physical things that we realize every day the pressing need for insight and understanding. It is, however, rather well to remember that we are slowly, rather painfully, growing. And this is true also of the structure of our knowledge. After man's inner life had rested for nearly 1900 years in the keeping of theology, it came to pass that in the middle of the 19th century, science began to dominate the thinking of humanity. As you probably remember from history, science had a rather long and hard fight to survive. Its roots and beginnings were shrouded in persecution and ridicule. It fought for a long time to try to prove to men that the earth was round. It also fought to establish the heliocentric system of astronomy. And those who first believed that the earth and the other planets moved around the sun were rather bitterly persecuted for this belief. Galileo was forced to publicly recant a fact that is now generally accepted. Copernicus only escaped persecution by a timely death. Thus, it is true that in its beginnings as an instrument of thought, science had certain complexes, as individuals do, who pass through stormy or difficult childhoods. And because of the intensities which are common in human nature, science turned rather strongly against not only the narrowness and intolerance of the past, but also against many good things which should not have been opposed or condemned. It is a strange but natural problem, apparently, that when men are condemned and gain a certain authority or freedom, they then turn and condemn others. So in its early development, modern science fought to separate itself from what it regarded as excessive superstition. The early scientists were not literally materialists. Most of them had rather strong religious convictions. But at the same time, they seemed to be aggressively nonconformists. And as a way of assuring their own survival, they cut off most of the associations, not only with religion, but also with philosophy. They wanted to be regarded as a fact-finding group. They wanted facts to be available to all mankind. This idea was perhaps rather noble in itself. But in this search for fact, science soon came to a dilemma. There just were not very many facts available. And even though we have progressed tremendously in the last century, we are still very short of facts, particularly those facts which deal with the inner constitution of man. Science, by its very methodology, demanded that facts should be established upon things that could be seen, could be touched, could be felt, could be known through experience or through experimentation. And gradually, it developed a criticism and a policy in which it held the exclusive right to determine what was fact. It was inevitable, as Bacon, one of the fathers of science, had pointed out earlier, that where we become intensely dedicated to facts and cannot find these facts, that we develop new superstitions. We are not free from superstition merely because we deny it. And he also pointed out that to claim to be completely free of superstition is itself a superstition. We are just not in the position to get at all the knowledge that is necessary to take the mysterious and the marvelous and the miraculous out of life as we know it. In fact, there are a number of questions as to whether we gain much by trying to be utterly factual. Science has gained a reputation for a rather prosaic, narrow outlook on life simply because it tried to be factual. As time went on, scientifically trained persons and those belonging to what might be termed the new method of thinking drifted toward materialism, and they also drifted into the more executive brackets of education and mental leadership. Thus we gradually passed into a period of extraordinary skepticism in which it became fashionable to doubt everything, even to the degree that scientists doubted each other. As the time went on also, it was demonstrated that the factual mind, completely sincere, could get into its own difficulties. Facts established apparently upon adequate foundations were overturned in 20 years. And out of the entire procedure, there has developed a new attitude of caution. Even the scientist today is not quite as ready to expound his theories or pronounce his facts as he was 50 years ago. Around the turn of the 20th century, the development of psychology brought a new pattern to operate in the lives of men. Psychology had a secret desire of its own, perhaps arising from a kind of inferiority complex. The psychologist wished to be a scientist. He wanted to be absolutely factual. He wanted to use the best and most approved scientific methods to sustain every thought and theory that he had. He liked to be regarded as a professional person, well educated, free from all excessive intemperances of the mind, and certainly cleansed of all superstitions. He got himself so clean there was nothing left. In fact, in this process of cleansing his nature from everything he did not know and could not prove, he ended up with very little, because there was not much that he could with certainty know or could with certainty prove. One interesting complication faced the psychologist that probably did not so deeply affect the other so-called exact sciences. The psychologist was not only a person with certain fallibilities in himself, but he had chosen a field which was extremely difficult to organize. He was trying to assume that he could put man into a category, that he was to be able to take human beings and organize them into distinct patterns and pronounce for them that which was normal, abnormal, or subnormal. He had chosen one of the most difficult objects in nature upon which to establish infallible categories. He was forced gradually to realize that mankind is a little different from most of the other creations with which science had labored. You could pretty well organize geology. The rocks had a certain consistency about them. You could do rather well in botany, and you could do very well in natural history. But when it came to man, you suddenly found that you were dealing with an individual. Humanity is not just a herd with common instincts. There are enough instincts in common to create a certain sense of possibility that they could be classified. But the moment this classification began, it became noticeable that there were too many exceptions. These exceptions are almost as common as exceptions in German verbs, so they become very, very embarrassing. As time went on, we also observed that the new method, as we like to think of it, this method of exactitudes, of practicalness, of freedom from all overtones and undertones, if possible, was leading to more trouble. In some way, we were unbalancing the natural processes and purposes of nature. We were trying to make man into a creature that he was not intended to be. And we were imposing upon him arbitrary rules which nature did not sanction or sustain. And by degrees, our early psychological researches began to reveal a certain lack of fruitfulness. There was some achievement, as there always is when men try to think. But this achievement was not consistent. The thought itself was not consistent. And very soon schools began to appear within the structure of psychology, breaking it into more or less competitive groups. It was obvious that there was more than one explanation for a given phenomenon. And as the explanations increased, it became further evident that no one knew the facts. We were probing, we were struggling, we were trying, and gained a certain amount of advantage in so doing. Most persons today, thinking about the material sciences, and in particular the mental sciences, are more or less inclined to assume that there have been no important changes in policy in the last 25 years. When some question arises, we still quote Freud or Adler, although perhaps the layman quotes them more frequently than the professional. We assume that we have created a thought image of what psychology is, and therefore that we are in a position to define its purposes, point out its weaknesses, and assail its conclusions. Actually, the psychologist of today is primarily a person. He is perhaps better equipped to know what is wrong with what he is doing than anyone else. He has had some bitter disappointments. He has tried with varying degrees of sincerity to advance convictions that he held as firmly as any theologian held the convictions of the persons of the Trinity. But both the theologian and the psychologist have come to a common misunderstanding. And in the last 10 or 20 years in particular, there has been a gradual but increasing revolt throughout the entire area of science against materialism. We hardly perhaps realize this. We are so used to certain effects that we are not able to estimate entirely what is going on in the minds of the individuals behind these policies. One of the important changes undoubtedly was brought about by the development of nuclear fission. We now realize that, considering the experimental period, we have already had 20 years of nuclear scientific research, and we are unhappy about the whole thing, and so are most of the scientists involved in it. Having had certain optimisms about this, we discover these optimisms were not well founded. Yet scientific optimism as to the benefits of scientific progress is not dissimilar to the optimism of religious leaders or philosophers. Nearly every religious leader and philosopher in the history of mankind who was worth the name overestimated human nature. They have all believed that man wanted to be happy. They all believed that man, if confronted with certain information which would help him to grow, would unanimously desire to grow. It's rather unhappy when you realize that this position cannot be sustained. And science, looking back over the last 20 years of atomic research, has become saddened by the fact that most of the research, most of the money expended in it, most of the so-called advance of knowledge resulting from it, most of all these elements has been applied merely to destructive ends. Now, anyone who has a family and children, who is living in a community existence, and who has hopes and fears, as most of these persons have, cannot completely disregard the evidence of his own senses. If he does, he's not a good scientist. And science itself is hanging its head in a kind of psychological shame. It is unhappy, it is disillusioned, frustrated, neurotic, and just about ready for a psychologist itself. The psychologists, to help the situation out, are neurotic, frustrated, unhappy, disappointed, and disillusioned, and almost in a position to shake their fists at science. This is a new situation which might never have happened had it not been for nuclear fission. Certainly would not have happened for a number of additional years. Now to every other situation is added the impending danger which we now face, a danger which science can no longer control even if it wants to. We say no longer control because while theoretically it might be controlled, we are again not able to hope that our confidence in human nature can look forward to an immediate reform of people. This again is beyond expectation. In all of this confusion, educated, cultured, trained technicians are beginning to realize the tremendous lack of internal resource. They know beyond doubt that something is wrong in a system which does not give them hope, faith, or insight. At this time, there are groups all over the world of highly trained professional persons, names internationally recognized as leaders in their fields, who are convinced that materialism is a dead failure. Now, this is not coming from what we call the little people. This is not coming from the victims. This is not coming from the dissatisfied majority. It is coming from that trained minority that, to a degree at least, is responsible for the general dissatisfaction. New younger generations of thinkers are coming up. Many of them went through World War II. These men and women are not satisfied with the definitions and processes now going on in science. Yet we must always recognize that there must be two levels functioning at the same time. There is the reactionary, who will cling to the bitter end to whatever he has already accepted, and who is practically impervious to new ideas. Then there is the progressive, who is trying to break through this pattern and comes upon the common difficulty, namely that the reactionaries, because of their age, because of their reputations, and because of their own strategic processing, are now in most of the critical, dominant positions. They are now in the saddle, so to say, and the younger men are having great difficulty even being heard. So the progressive and the reactionary are locked in a struggle. The progressives, for the most part, are asking for and demanding a new evaluation of the entire problem of man's inner life. They are beginning to realize that without the knowledge of man's nature and purpose, nearly all other knowledge remains inadequate. Yet these very people do not know which way to turn themselves. They are reluctant to go back to the theologies, because to them the theological position also was not well taken. And they point out with rather, shall we say, prejudiced, but at the same time perhaps consciously honest, they point out with such feelings that for thousands of years theology dominated and yet was not able to meet the human problem in a satisfactory way. Theology led to the same difficulties on another level that science faces today. And because of the general tendency and temperament prevailing, philosophy has practically no chance. This means that a major change must be made, and a good many men are trying to work out this change. We cannot say, perhaps, that they are now the majority, but they are in much the same position as the dynamic minority in the beginning of the 20th century. This minority took psychology away from Scottish metaphysics and forced it into the open as a branch of learning. These modern young men are striving to take the human being out of the rigid pattern of early 20th century psychology and create a new interpretation of man, an interpretation consistent with what psychology has revealed that is helpful, and at the same time attempting to correct the increasingly obvious weaknesses of psychological theory and practice. It has become quite a problem, and it is well to realize that the war is on, that there is not a completely static situation. How this will affect our thinking may not be entirely clear at the moment, but I think we may expect in the course of not too long a time a strong breakthrough on the philosophical level, a search for a meaningful human being, an effort to understand what man is. Science will probably take the attitude that all such findings cannot be regarded as conclusive. The effort now is to create a less dogmatic position. We want to come to that condition in thinking in which every time we change something, we do not have to overturn the entire structure of knowledge. We do not anymore wish to dogmatically declare that man is the psychological entity that Freud assumed that he was. Nor do we want to place another psychological entity, perhaps a little more mature, in the place of the earlier one. We want to find ways of making progress a more constructive, smooth procedure. We do not wish to have to attack something every time we want to grow. We would rather like to have an open-end attitude in which there is room for more knowledge, that we do not take these powerful, aggressive, dogmatic positions, but assume the fact of knowledge limitation and attempt to unfold gradually a new philosophy of man, a philosophy to be supported by experience, by experimentation, by counseling, and by every method available in the philosophical and scientific fields. The moment problem, the problem that is now dominating nearly every searcher into the areas of mental phenomena, is the need to find what man really requires in order to be a well-ordered person. We cannot assume that what we now have is enough in the light of the rapidly increasing delinquency rate, the rapidly increasing mental illness, and the general lack of individual coordination and cooperation. Science now assumes as reasonable that the present condition of man, the present psychological state of the human being in the year 1962, come 63, is evidence of something, that there is a cause behind what we are at this moment, and that in some way we have missed badly, or else the work of the last 50 years would have corrected evils instead of increasing them. We meant well, we tried, as most forms of learning have endeavored since the beginning of time. It wasn't a case of maliciousness. It was a case of overenthusiasm and an effort to try to find too smug and trite an answer for something that required a great deal more thought. So we were faced with a number of questions on a psychological level that would never have been asked 20 years ago. One of these questions is a very basic one. Is man an immortal being? Does human consciousness survive death? To the religious person, there is no question about this. And there is also no doubt whatever in the mind of the atheist. These two positions are quite convinced that they have the answer. The religionist says anyone who does not believe in the survival of human consciousness is stupid. The materialist of the atheistic conviction says anyone who believes in immortality is stupid. Now, these two positions cannot both be right. There is one stupidity and one position is right. The present trend is definitely to assume that the possibility of the survival of human consciousness has not been disproved in the terms of science. This is a big step for science. And it seems to us that it is such a slow, rather foolish step. We say to ourselves they should have known this in the beginning, but they didn't. And if we get a little too smug on this point of view, we can say to ourselves, having convinced our own hearts and minds of immortality, what are we doing about it? If we believe it, why do not we live consistently with it? So the believer can also be open to some rebuke. The believer belongs in his own conviction to a moral universe. He believes in God. He believes in spirit. He believes in spiritual justice. He believes in personal virtue. The believer has had all of this for a long time, yet it has not been able to stop war, nor has it been able to prevent crime. So we cannot take too smug a position, even if we are believers, because there is something inadequate in a belief that never causes us to make a dynamic use of that belief in the solving of personal or collective difficulties. On the other hand, the modern scientist, in the midst of his dilemma, and not being trained in matters relating to these things, being completely ignorant, for the most part, of all of the theories and concepts of theology, is inclined today to turn to theology. He is inclined to turn to anything which looks like a constructive escape from his present problem. He is finding it more difficult to live with himself. He is finding it more difficult to trust the man working on the same project with him. And this type of suspicion, doubt, and insecurity, not particularly fortunate or happy for anyone concerned. In the hope of solving this problem, this general concept, difficulty, the tendency now, for the first time, is to reach outside of the boundaries of our own thinking. Western man has worshipped Western man for 25 centuries. He has completely ignored another hemisphere larger than his own, with a population far greater than his own. He has assumed that progress has been in the keeping of the West, and he assumes it on grounds which he thinks he can prove. The most common obvious proof being the tremendous improvement of the standard of living among Western people. He feels that this is a sure indication of progress. We live better. We have more. Life is longer. Taxes are higher. All of these things are sure indications of advancement. This was fine until nuclear fission. And all of a sudden, one scientific pattern of research has not only brought us the gravest doubt, but we suddenly find ourselves in the imminent danger of wiping out everything that we call Western progress. We realize that all of this progress has been suspended from a basic concept so fragile that a group of skillful thinkers in the 20th century were able to set it all at naught. For today we are in a possible position of wiping out progress as we might wipe the chalk off of a blackboard. Thus we can no longer have quite the sense of security about progress. We are not quite so sure that we have been going in the right direction. 30 years ago, a man would have been ridiculed for questioning the blessings of knowledge. Today we not only question, but doubt. And we are also not only doubting, but thoroughly disillusioned. Therefore, we have begun to consider the possibility of investigating other patterns of culture than our own, to see if anyone else is doing a better job of it. We then run against another interesting but critical situation, namely that in the last 30 years particularly, our pattern of culture has hypnotized practically every other people. Day by day, our ways of doing things have been accepted by those with lower standards of living, who in their desire either to compete or perhaps only to improve themselves have taken on our ways, with the result that the whole world now is becoming ill with the same sickness that we have. Other nations, long ignored by the powerful Western bloc, have developed a serious complex and are now trying to throw that off by taking on our peculiar type of abnormal psychological attitude. So we are not even finding it very easy to explore the roots of other people's culture. We find that these other people, to copy us, have turned against their native cultures the same way we have turned against ours. So the whole world is more or less in the same difficulty. Out of all of the probing and the problem comes this basic situation of need, however. And the need centers around what is man. For the first time, we've got to turn from what he does to what he is. For the first time, we have got to question what constitutes an adequate human person. We are no longer able to say that man is growing inwardly because his possessions are increasing materially. We are no longer able to say that comforts and conveniences and commodities make better people. For a long time, there was a group in this country that was working desperately to improve the condition of labor. I came across an article written many years ago in going through an old file recently, in which an individual said that when working days and hours are reduced so that a man can make a good and substantial living by working 8 hours a day for 5 days a week, we will have the greatest explosion of human spiritual growth in history. It didn't work. Now we are assured that man will be more cultural if he only works 3 days a week, 4 hours a day. There were people who seriously believed that if everyone could have the golden rule translated into their own language, the world would be saved. So the golden rule has been translated into over 500 languages and dialects, and there seems to be some doubt as to whether salvation is universal. These are optimisms, they are hopes, but there's something about man that is forever frustrating the hopes of the optimist. So we do not believe that any major change in man's external condition is a guarantee that he will become enlightened. And it is more obvious every day that the only answer to the problem is not that the world will change, but that man will change. Something has to be done to bring man into a safer relationship with the world by changing man. This is perhaps the new concept of psychological philosophy that is evolving in various nations of the world. Certainly it is contributing largely to the professional thinking of our time. The time has come for us to get to work to find out what to do about man. In the West, we have no final technique for this at the present moment. And we are scouring around looking for other techniques. A few years ago, Indian yoga was reserved for eccentric Americans who seemed to have a tremendous desire to gaze at their own navels. This situation has also completely changed. Today, the whole world is exploring yoga, trying to find out what it is basically about. Is there something there that will help man to grow? We are exploring Zen with the same tremendous enthusiasm. What has Zen to offer man in trouble? A few years ago, we wouldn't have questioned. We didn't care. All these foreign ideas came from barbarians and heathens who were not worth our attention. But our own situation has become so extreme we have to look for something. The same is true of our researches into Taoism. Taoist mysticism is perhaps offering a certain key to the unlocking of Christian mysticism, which has been neglected for centuries. In the effort to meet this situation, many churches in this country and in Europe and Canada have begun to consider the ministry of healing as part of an essential Christian ministry. This has had its effect upon our general thinking. Everywhere we are reaching out now in search of something we really hope we can find, for we suspect that somewhere in the history of human thinking, someone hit upon the facts. We were not wise enough or understanding enough to recognize that person or to follow the rules which they gave, but that person must have existed. Someone, somewhere along the line, was right. And our trouble was we didn't recognize them. Perhaps many were right and have become a block of people now generally disregarded. But we have to get back into the problem and do something about it. Western man has always had trouble with the problem of his own ego. Egotism has been his difficulty, and no system of culture that he has developed has really gone to the root of this. Man likes to believe in his own superiority. It is natural for him to build upon this sense of egoism an aggressive, dominant life built too much upon the possibility of exploiting other persons. This attitude has undoubtedly been at the base of most of our great troubles, but we do not know just how to work the matter into a successful conclusion. Science for a long time seriously doubted the existence of the human soul. It believed that this human soul as we knew it was merely a massing of pressures, that what we call the human soul is nothing but a chemical reaction set up in the psychic level of function, and that the soul is a massing or an aggregate of sensory processes, that the soul therefore is created by the individual in the process of living, did not exist before the body, could not exist without a body, providing it with sensory manifestations, and will not survive a body, because this soul itself is merely a refinement. It is an extract of body, and therefore cannot exist without it. Now this led to the higher skepticism. We began to ridicule people who held this view. Yet science has been able to gain considerable evidence that there's some truth in it. Yet science is not in a position to do anything with what it has discovered except to make matters worse. Because as it demolishes the human soul, it drags down the entire human cultural program. With the soul vanishes good and beauty and love and friendship, veneration, respect, honor, and regard. The soul, which has within itself conjured into existence these concepts of constructive virtue, if it is what science thinks it is, could only conjure illusions. And having stripped ourselves of all illusions, we found the first illusion that we lost was honesty. Yet we cannot live without it. In this dilemma, modern psychology is becoming sensitive to the philosophy of Buddha, because to a very large degree Buddha followed the same concept which we think is so new and so wonderful, and taught it 2,500 years ago, in which he also questioned that this thing which we call the self or the ego has a solid existence. But instead of this skepticism, which has been called agnosticism and atheism by missionaries, did not lead to the same end that ours has led to. Our skepticism arose in religion and ended in materialism. Buddhist skepticism arose apparently in materialism and resulted in one of the world's greatest religions. Now, there has to be a difference to produce so vast a change in attitude. It seems that the one thing that Buddhism had to help its skepticism along was something that we do not have, and that was an overall concept of purpose. In Buddhism, there is not the sterility of Western materialism, because it is permeated with a vast idealism. An idealism which Buddha demonstrated, strangely enough, did not depend upon the God concept generally accepted by Western man. In other words, Buddha taught that a man does not have to believe in God to be good. Man has to believe in good to be good. If he believes in God, fine. If he does not believe in God, it is still all right as long as he practices good. This was the critical point. Here was a materialism in Asia based upon a very simple statement. In looking through a book on the celebration of the 2500th anniversary of Buddha in Siam, I found this little statement, which I think is rather interesting. Theoretically, Siam belongs to the southern school of Buddhism, the Hinayana, or small school, which means that it clings definitely to the agnosticism of Buddha. Yet this is the statement that they officially made as the basis of their religious life, and why they celebrated nationally under imperial sanction and with imperial blessing this Buddhist anniversary. They summarized the words of Buddha and the thoughts of Buddhism in this simple statement: cease to do evil, cultivate the good, purify the mind. This was the philosophy. Now, in the presence of this, it is interesting to realize that these statements are a common denominator of both theism and atheism. It would be a poor atheist, indeed, and there are not many quite that impoverished, who would not acknowledge these three statements as right. There is no religion that can deny them. So we have a common statement, a statement of what must be done. And this was the peculiar strength of Buddha's original revelation. Now, in order that we shall not come into a misunderstanding here, I should also like to mention that from the original writings, from the old canon, from the sutras forming the original Tripitaka, Buddha was not an atheist. He was not even an agnostic, although many Buddhists believe this. Buddha was simply concerned with one problem, and he stated himself definitely, in his own words, that he was not an atheist, that he never denied the existence of a divine power, a divine being, or a divine principle at the root of life. He just said, let it rest, because under the existing conditions, man's consciousness is not capable of a universal acceptance of the nature of this abstract being. And because when we try to define it, we only fall into controversy, leave it alone. Assume that it is there, but go to work and do the things that are necessary now. Cease to do evil. Cultivate the good, purify the mind. Western people are beginning to take hold of this concept, particularly on the level of psychology. Suddenly, it becomes obvious that whatever we believe, whatever concepts we hold, whatever nature we assume exists within us, the problem of conduct rises to supreme importance. That conduct is possible on any level of believing. It is perfectly possible for an atheistic communist to practice the three virtues which we have mentioned here and still be a faithful follower of Lenin and Karl Marx. It is perfectly possible for the most orthodox religious organization to teach these three principles from its pulpit without any trace or threat of nonconformity. Thus, where we've all fallen down has been in making theory more important than practice. We held ourselves to be measured by what we affirmed, not by what we did. We gained a certain sense of righteousness and virtue from belonging and not from behaving, where the problem rested. So the immediate utility from a scientific standpoint is obvious. Supposing we assume that the soul of man is eternal, is there any reason why that soul in its own way should not perform the natural virtues? If we assume that the soul is eternal, should it not cease in evil? Should it not also practice the good? Should it not also purify itself? Socrates would have said yes. Plato would have said yes. Thus, we are not talking about any difference by which we would split one sect from another. What we are trying to do is to establish, perhaps on a scientific level or a psychological level, the absolute necessity for right conduct. If we wish to assume, for example, that the soul is a generation of the body, that it has no existence apart from the mental processes that we know. If we wish to even accept this, we are faced with the same necessity, for it follows absolutely from what psychology has already demonstrated that wrong conduct sickens the soul, causing its journey through this life to be one of misery and pain. If the individual ceases to do evil, practices the good, and purifies the mind, we will have practically no mental illness. However, we wish to assume the operation works. Matters not very much in practical value. We know that the individual is sick because his mental, emotional complex is sick. Now we try to find out how to make it well. So we develop techniques, skills. We approach this sick soul much as we might approach a boil or a bunion. We feel that we must lance it or cut it out. We therefore develop techniques for performing various kinds of major and minor psychological surgery upon the human soul. We discover a little area and we say, give the patient the anesthesia, we're going to cut this out. So he has it cut out, comes out of the anesthesia, and in a few weeks he has another similar area and we start all over again. We suddenly come to know that the soul is not like the body in one respect, that we cannot control it by physical means. We cannot completely control it by counseling. We cannot control it by psychoanalysis. The truly mentally sick can be helped to some measure and often to considerable measure by psychiatry. But on the level of psychology, which involves mostly dispositional problems, we cannot say that the individual will be cured by changing an attitude, by becoming less or more sophisticated, by escaping from one superstition to fall into another, or by trying to adjust himself or be adjusted to a world which is totally out of adjustment in the first place. We struggle with these things and nothing happens, or at least not enough happens. And we move the entire problem to its essential level, which is conduct. Until we can prove to man in general that conduct is the foundation of peace, health, and security, we will not be able to meet the situation. Science has one advantage over every other branch of knowledge today. While it is feared by many, doubted by a few, it is accepted by most. If science, therefore, can scientifically demonstrate and solemnly pronounce the importance of conduct in the solution of affairs, that it takes precedent over everything else, this will be accepted. This will be taught. This will be included in the curriculum for the young. This will permeate our higher educational system and will finally trickle down even into the kindergarten. It will also go through our homes, go through every institution that we know, and will gain wider and wider acceptance, for the very simple reason that in this very simple formula is a unit of truth which man will never be able to disprove. He may be able to enlarge his knowledge of it. He may be able to go further and further into the problems of conduct, but he will never be able to prove to himself or anyone else that a person who breaks the laws of nature can be happy. On this ground, we have then a new way of approaching this problem of the human soul. Psychology in general has tried to act as a cathartic medium. It has tried to relieve the pressure of the soul through purging. Back in the Middle Ages, when a doctor did not know what else to do with a sick person, he either gave him an emetic or some purging material, or he bled him. That is, it was assumed that you had to get rid of the impurities by getting them out of the system. They worked so industriously at this on George Washington that they killed him. But they had to get rid of the material which they regarded as the cause of the trouble. Our tendency on a more refined scale has been this same process of purging. We are trying to apply a psychological laxative to the soul. We are trying to clean it out by getting rid of what is in there that seems to be toxic. We assume that mental and emotional difficulties are due to psychic toxin. Therefore, we've got to get something in there to get rid of that toxin. We need something that will change this balance from acid to alkaline. We cannot do it in our present way. What we have failed to realize is that the soul in modern man is not suffering just from ordinary toxin. It is suffering from pernicious anemia. Now, if you take a human being and you put them upon an unreasonable diet, and you do not provide the body with adequate food, the digestive system will become toxic. If it does not have proper food to maintain its functions, acidity will develop, and this has to be watched for with great care by all persons attempting to diet. The lack of adequate nutrition can cause acidity just as rapidly as the presence of a foreign and negative food element. In the same way, psychologically, the individual who has nothing inside can develop just as much acidosis as the person who has the wrong thing inside. And our trouble is very largely now that there is nothing. We have systematically tried to get rid of the wrong thing, and the acidity rate has gone up. We have not given the system, the psychological system, the nutrition it needs. And this nutritional problem means that we have to break this rule which has gradually come to be prominent, in which we must not interfere with the psychic activities of people. We must be completely non-directive. We mustn't ever tell the individual what to do. We must change this point and realize that from the beginning of time, education has to a large degree been concerned with providing the psychic nature of man with an adequate code of personal conduct. You've got to get that code in there. Now, some will say that if we follow our present procedure, that the psychic nature itself has within it certain normalcy, which will take over. I believe there is validity in this point, but there is a reason why it doesn't operate properly. One of the evidences of that is the so-called progressive method of handling children. I might add that it is no longer progressive. It is now considered as defunct as the dodo. But for a while, everyone thought it was tremendous. And that is, do not lead your child. But too many people found out in the end that the child was leading them into disaster instead. You cannot take the child, ignore its cultural needs, and expect it to blossom like the lilies of the field. The reason why the lily blossoms and the child does not is very simple. The lily has no personal mental existence. The lily can do nothing but blossom, whereas the human being has the right to either blossom or to destroy itself. In the need, therefore, we do not wish to imply that every child must be indoctrinated, but that there are simple principles of character which the child and the adult must both understand. And therapy involves the fact of getting these facts to the individual who obviously needs them. This, of course, throws a great deal more responsibility upon the counselor. The counselor is no longer able to memorize a technique as a surgeon might memorize an operation. He is no longer able to turn to a certain book. He is no longer able to take the 4-year course and come out of it with a methodology that he can apply to everyone. Also, he suddenly discovers that if he becomes a factor in the moral life of people, he must be more careful of what he says and what he does. He must be more sure of himself in a different way. Purely scientifically speaking, he can set a process in operation and wash his hands of it. This is the technique, this is the school, this is the method. It either works or it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, it should have worked. But there is no sense of personal responsibility. The practitioner may try to do the best job that he can, but it never occurs to him to think that he might have tried some other way and gotten further. But if you turn now to this problem of instruction, It means that the practitioner must also be a teacher, must also be able to meet the needs of the individual with an internal pattern, a pattern that has foundations in valid facts, and if these facts be considered relative rather than absolute, so be it. Because we are not dealing with man as he will be 50,000 years from now, nor as he was 10,000 years ago. We are dealing with man as he is now. And we must therefore apply to him as he is now the best of what we know now, assuming that if we do this methodically, honorably, continuously, we will ultimately not only know more, but be able to impart more, and the person receiving the information will be able to understand better. So our problem of searching for the meaningful soul in man does not imply that this soul is not a powerful structure in itself, does not imply that this soul might be, and probably is, in its natural state self-governing. There is nothing to question this. There is also, however, nothing to indicate that this soul in self-governing is able to go beyond the government of itself and of its bodies. There is no indication that the soul, because it is self-governing, must be infallible, or that it in any way transcends the experience patterns which have been etched upon it. These points we do not actually know. We may assume that the soul is a vehicle of karma, that it carries with it the pressures of previous existence. If we wish to assume this, well and good. Our problem is not altered by this in its basis in any way. The theory is altered, but the practice is not touched. The practice remains. Socrates takes the attitude that the soul, in its own nature, is self-governing, that it is inspired by internal insight, and that this self-governing power of the soul is destroyed by its involvement in body. By his thinking, therefore, our conscious, mental, emotional, and physical attitudes block the soul, and that all thought, emotion, or action contrary to the nature of the soul sickens the soul, not in its own substance, but in its power to manifest. We may assume a telegraph operator sitting in his office and another telegraph operator many miles away. Across this distance, by means of a telegraphic wire, a message is sent. This message, however, can no longer be sent if at any point along the wire it is cut. This ends it. This no way changes the intelligence of the sending operator, who knows what he wants to send, nor does it change the nature of the receiving operator, who would be able to interpret this message if it came through. There will simply be no message. Somewhere in man's nature, the link between the soul and the body is a mysterious kind of wire, visible or invisible, probably invisible. If this wire is cut, the relationship between the soul and the body is destroyed. If this wire becomes tangled, confused, rusted out, or is subject to any of the storms of vicissitudes which knock down telegraph poles, the clarity and propriety of the message will be interrupted. Socrates took the attitude, therefore, that it was not the soul that could be essentially sick, but that the links between the objective conduct of man and the soul could be so distorted that the human being would substitute the concept that his own mistakes were himself, and would therefore be unable to respond to the instincts or to the information conveyed by the soul. He finally came to the same conclusion. namely that the individual who would rescue his own organism so that it could become a clear instrument for the manifestation of the soul's power, assuming the soul to have that power, that the way that this was done was very simple. Cease to do evil, practice good, purify the mind. This was his law just as much as it was the law of the East. If you assume that the soul is the governing reality, then you must bring the body into a state in which it can accept government. And by the body we mean not only the physical but the mental and emotional parts of man. It is obvious that the soul cannot function through an ignorant and unprepared mind. It cannot break through the fixations of the mind which says, I will believe only what I want to believe, whether I see something else or not. Nor can the soul break through the tempest of emotions by which the individual is constantly perpetuating his own attitudes with total indifference as to his real needs or purposes. The soul cannot break through into the body. If this body is loaded with toxin, if the individual has reduced its efficiency by excess, has become an alcoholic or a narcotic addict, or has so variously abused the body that it can no longer respond to the needs of the inner life. Wherever you approach the problem, you have the same situation on your hands. Either the soul is there and knows what to do and can only do it if we cooperate, or else with the materialistic point of view we are building the soul and it will be what we build into it. Therefore, if we do not build these proper ingredients into it, we will not be able to live comfortably with the psychic entity after it is created. New psychology points out the tremendous need of re-educating the psychic entity, preventing the individual from making the mistakes in the beginning, which lead inevitably to emotional stress, uncertainty, and confusion. This, again, is a regulation of conduct. There is no other way in which we can approach this problem. The individual must change his attitudes and live according to better attitudes. If he does not make these changes, he cannot enjoy any different type of psychic integration. Let us assume now for a moment that the soul is some kind of a surviving and abiding entity. That the soul is here for a reason. If the soul is the governor of the body, the life of man here is finally purposed to the need of the soul, not the need of the body. We would not have any particular reason for existing if our total purpose was merely that this physical body should become more illustrious. If we spent all of our lives catering to it as we might to a small spoiled child, and some people do this, we come out at the end of it all with nothing, not even a body. If the whole purpose of this is that the body shall receive our total attention, that we shall nurse it as some athlete might nurse his brawn, then we must watch this body gradually enfeeble and fall under the miseries that have always been present in the flesh and which science has been able to somewhat delay but not to stop. If, on the other hand, we assume that our emotions are the real reason for ourselves, if we assume that we are merely here to live our lives in the gratification of sensory perception, where are we? The sensory perceptions must cease with the body. We spend our entire time being happy, or trying to be, and end up completely miserable. We find that no way can we live in which we can follow the intemperances of the emotions without disaster. If we want to be free emotionally, we must destroy law and order. because the individual's emotions cannot be curbed. There is no way in which an excess of emotion ever produces a surfeit. The more emotion we have, the more we demand. And we would end up in such a personal tempest that we could not live with ourselves or anyone else. We have no indication that the emotions can censor themselves adequately. The same thing is true of the mind. If we become mental entities, we can become highly skillful in many things, but we now know psychologically that the mind cannot give us the answers. It can help. It can bring in a variety of interesting testimonies. But if we do not have some kind of insight, some kind of superior understanding above mental process, we cannot use the evidence that is given to us. Mind by itself, without leadership and without guidance, has always led to a sterile intellectualism that has gone nowhere. And in the life of the intellectual, this happens. He knows a great deal about a great many things. He is miserable, bored, and unadjusted. So the only answer, as Socrates tells us, is that over this structure has been placed a natural leadership, and that there is in man some coordinator that represents the best of himself, and that this coordinator is also some way subtly aware of its own relationships to universal patterns and processes, and that whether aware or not, the soul, freed from all excess, will operate according to the nature of itself, without being deformed, mutilated, or injured. It would therefore impel us to live naturally. And as the soul is the highest aspect of the body or personality that we know of, we may assume that if it ruled, we would be ruled by the best of ourselves. And because in the soul we recognize the source of inspiration, of art, of music, of culture, of the humanities, and of values, we may assume that if the soul is properly cleansed, if its needs are properly met, or if we wish to view it differently, if its own potentials are properly cultured and educated, we would be in the best possible place that man can be in. This is the new approach to our problem. This is the way it's looking now to more and more people. And this is the way we have a feeling that these processes are going to go. We are looking now for a meaningful internal, an internal that guides, an internal that has authority over our moods. We have two ways of getting this. One is to assume that we can educate the soul directly and that by its education it can bring the body into conformity. The other is to bring the body under the rulership of reason, assuming that by so doing we create a proper and peaceful empire in which the soul can rule. Probably both processes are necessary. Certainly it is distinctly necessary that all of our so-called intellectual attainment be moved out of the realm of theory and moved into the realm of conduct. Now some will feel that we do not know what is good always, that we do not know what is right, that there are things that we will still do wrong with the best of motives. Granted, but it is much better for us to do a few things wrong with the best of motives than to do many things so-called well with the worst of motives. Because finally, motivation itself is valuable. We know instinctively, as the greatest heritage of our race, that we must not perform works of evil. Each individual may define evil according to his own insight, but whatever to him is wrong, that he shall not do. And we all know that many of the things that we do are wrong, but we continue to do them. On the level of morals, to do that which injures, to do that which spreads sorrow, grief, or pain, that which detracts from the nobility of our own character or reflects upon the characters of others. This is wrong. We have known this since primitive times. Savages know this. People who are still living in the Stone Age, little remnants and fragments of prehistoric cultures, know this and always have. Therefore, we have a right to believe that it is so. Cease to do evil. Do that which is good, and purify the mind. If we would take this simple code, we would find that most of our psychological problems would dissolve. We do not need to know so very, very much, because most of us at best can do so very, very little. What we need is the courage to do what we know, not always to seek more light, but to use some of the light that we have. In the same general thinking, if we do more and more as we know, or as we believe that we know, we observe that in private life, where persons do take these principles seriously from a philosophic or religious standpoint, they are better people. We can trust them further. And the truly sincere person living a simple code is the most trustworthy person in the world today. So these things do add up to something. If we do this type of thing, if we live this way, we will release whatever is in the soul, so that it can become an ever-increasing source of insight. But we also bring to the soul the therapy of our own acceptance of responsibility and value. As conflict ceases within ourselves, quietude can take over. And if the soul can make its will known to us, it must be when it can operate through a quiet, organized, peaceful, non-opinionated personality. If we can begin simple practices, we will find that they will lead to health. Everywhere today people are working on these problems. Some more rapidly than others, some more slowly. Some ponderously, some enthusiastically. I might say a few reluctantly. But at the same time, they have to. The world problem has stated itself, and people are trying. And as time goes on, this effort will bring greater reward and result. We are also becoming more international, interracial, intercultural in our thinking. We are not any longer completely locked in our own provincialism. It is growing, it is helping, it is building. And we can sincerely hope that in the years that lie ahead, man will develop an understanding of how to become a meaningful individual with internal resources appropriate to his needs. Will be able to mature his inner life, for without this, his outer life cannot be put in order. Well, time's up, so I guess we have to stop.